Alright, so now we're going to do the same thing that we did in our last lesson, which was graph sine and cosine, except now we're going to do it with a vertical shift. And so if we look back at this form of sine or cosine, we said all these letters do something to the function, and we've looked at A, that's going to be the amplitude. The B is going to change the period. Now we're going to look at this D value, and so the D value represents in the function a vertical shift. And so if D is greater than 0, or if D is positive, then the graph is going to shift up that many units. If D is negative, or if D is less than 0, then the graph is going to shift down that many units. Alright, and so let's look at this function. Now this function is written a little bit differently than how you'll see most of them. Most of the time you'll see it written as 3 cosine 2x plus 2. And so either way, this 2 is going to represent a vertical shift. And so I'm going to show you how to graph that, or use that to graph your function. So I'm still going to do the same things that I did in the last lesson. I'm going to find the amplitude. Amplitude is 3. And then the period, I'm going to put 2 pi over the number in front of x, which is just 2. And so that's going to simplify and reduce to just pi. Now, I'm going to go ahead and label the amplitude, not the amplitude, but the period on my graph, and divide it into 4 equal sections. Alright, and so then if I divide pi in half, that's just going to give me pi over 2. This will be negative pi over 2. Now, when it comes to labeling the amplitude, this is a little bit differently, or you do this a little bit differently, and this is how I do it. I like to go ahead and say, originally, if I had no shift up, then, because this is going to move it up 2. If I had no shift, I would have max values at 3. I would have zeros at 0, obviously. And then I would have min values at negative 3. But if I shift this function up 2, that's going to take all of these points and move them up 2. So I just have to add 2 to find out where they would now go. So the max would now be at 5. What were the zeros will be at 2. And then the mins are going to be at negative 1. And so then those are the values that I'm going to go label on my graph. So 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so when I graph this, this is cosine. I know cosine, if it's positive, and it is going to start up at a max. And so the max is going to be right here at 5. Now, at this next dash, I would go to a 0, but that 0 is shifted up 2 places. At my next point, I would go to a min, and that's going to go down to negative 1 now. I would go to a 0 right here, but it'll instead shift up 2 units, so it'll be about right there. And then our last point is going to be back at a max, and so that's going to be right there. And so now my function looks the same as it would, except shifted up. And so then I'm going to go back and do the same thing to the other side. So I would go to what would be a 0, then down to a min, back to what would be a 0, and then up to a max. And so cosine is always going to basically just look like a mirror image of itself. If we were to flip it over the y-axis, and we've looked at functions like that, so this is an even function, it would be the same on both sides. Alright, so 2 full periods of 2 cosine 4x. So first thing I'm going to do, same thing as I did last time, I'm going to find the amplitude, that's 2. The period this time is just I'm going to put 2 pi over, this is 4, so it's going to reduce to pi over 2. And then this is going to shift it down 1. So I'm going to go here and label what would be my maxes, zeros, and mins. So maxes would normally go up to 2, zeros would be at 0, mins would be at negative 2. And so now I'm going to take all of these values and shift them, this time down 1. So I'm going to subtract 1 from each of those numbers. And so maxes will be at 1, zeros at negative 1, and mins at negative 3. And so I'm going to go label these on the graph. So here's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, and then 1 would be right here. Alright, I'm also going to label the period on here, so this is going to be pi over 2. This will be negative pi over 2. And so to find that middle point, I'm just going to take pi over 2 and this time times it by 1/2. Multiplying by 1/2 and dividing by 2 are really the same thing. So I'm going to multiply by 1/2, so this is going to be pi over 4. And so this is going to be right here, pi over 4 and negative pi over 4. And so when I go to graph this is cosine, so cosine is going to start up at a max, and so the max is going to now be at 1. Where the zeros would be, they're going to be at -1. Then down to a min at -3. What would be a 0 at -1, and then up at a max. And so this side looks like this. And then the other side's going to look the same, it's just a reflection, so I'm going to go, what would be a 0, min, what would be a 0, max. And so there's this function. Alright, we got one more. Let's graph a sine. Alright, and so then start out the same. Amplitude is 4. This is flipped. I'm going to find the period. Period is 2 pi over. This is the same thing as saying 1/2 x. And so I'm going to put 2 pi over 1/2 and take this and flip and multiply. So 2 pi times 2 over 1 is just going to be 4 pi. Alright, so then maxes would normally be at 4, zeros at 0, mins at -4. And so then I'm going to shift this up 2 since I'm adding 2. And so now the maxes are going to be at 6, zeros at 2, mins at -2. And let's label that on our graph. So here's -2, positive 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Alright, and so then period out here is going to be at 4 pi, -4 pi. And so then obviously if I cut that in half, that's going to be at 2 pi. And this will be at -2 pi. Alright, now when I go to graph, this is sine. So sine would start at the origin, which would be a 0. And so the zeros are at 2 now. And so I'm going to start right here at 2. And then since this is flipped, normally sine would go up to a max first. But since it's flipped, I'm going to go down to a min first. And then back to what would be a 0 here. Then a max. Then a 0. And so there's that side. Now remember on sine, we're going to do the opposite of what we did to this side. And so then this is going to go up to a max. Then what would be a 0? Down to a min. What would be a 0? Alright, and so then here is our sine function for this function right here. Alright, and then in our next video, we'll learn how to graph horizontal shifts.